Hello and welcome to my kitchen. So I know a lot of people are currently getting involved in sourdough, but it's something that I've been doing for a number of years now, and kind of started out for a number of reasons. One of the particular reasons was I wanted to create a loaf of bread for my mother-in-law and father-in-law. They consume bread every day. It's a staple of their life. We're Italian. Started out trying to make a yeasted bread using a traditional packet yeast, and didn't like the results. It just wasn't where I wanted it to be. So I started to research about sourdough dough that goes back literally centuries. It's something that has been occurring potentially for about 4,500 years. In the Egyptian times, they were using sourdough ferment. They in fact recovered some of the yeast from a Egyptian pot and were able to revive it and get it to make yeasted bread. About the oldest known continuously used sourdough starter is about 120, 130 years old and continues to be used every day. So I created two sourdough starters. Both of them are Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato. These have been were fed yesterday, so they're kind of on the low end of their activity right now, but I wanted to show you them at this point and what I do to really start the process of making bread. The first thing I do is I turn my scale on with my container that I'm going to use, tar the scale or zero it, and I'm going to start adding to this flour, water, and some of my starter to make my levan. About a tablespoon of my starter. So in it goes, and that's it. Once again, tar the scale, and we start adding flour. I'm going to make a country loaf, basically a bread that includes some white flour and whole wheat flour. In order to make the starter, we're going to use the 125 grams of white flour or bread flour, strong bread flour. Try to get as close as possible. I'm dead on there. Worked out really nice. Now we're going to use another 25 grams of whole wheat flour to get to my 150 gram. Trying to be as accurate as possible, and everything is weighed in grams and not in cups. You'll find that bakers do not use volumetric measurements because they're not accurate. You can't really judge how much flour is in a cup of flour because you can compress it very easily. Now I need to add to this 150 grams of water, and I use just filtered tap water. So I'm going to take this now to a total of 300 grams by adding 150 grams of water. And there we go. So we're now at the point where we're just going to stir this up and let it incorporate the starter, which we've added, to the flour and water. And basically what's happening now is this natural bacteria, your yeast that is wild, is now got a food source. It's got the water, it's got the flour to begin to propagate and grow and become your levan, which is going to be your yeast, if you will, or your rising agent for your dough. Cover it with something. I happen to use a shower cap. This will now, at room temperature, take about 8 hours to get to the point where it'll be ready to make bread. You can control it if you don't have 8 hours. If you got more time you need, you can lower the temperature maybe to 50-ish degrees. Now what you want to do is you want to get it to a point of activity where you know it's ready to be used. So let me just show you a levan that's ready to be used and how we know. So this is going to go get tucked away and be ready in about 8 to 12 hours. Here's one that I made yesterday and is active. Maybe a little bit past its prime, but still active, and I can tell by testing it. All we need is some water, and we're going to see if it floats. If it floats, it's good. I'm going to use this water here just to make it easy. And we're going to take a tablespoon of this, and we're going to drop it in. And we're going to see that it comes to the surface. It floats. It means it's active. It's full of gas. It's ready to go. We're going to be able to use that. Let's begin the process of making our bread today. A water container. This is going to contain our levain. We're going to add our water component to this vessel, and we're going to add our flour component to this vessel. So I'm going to add 700 grams of water. Again, I've got 1,000 grams of flour, 700 grams of water. That's 70% hydration. We're going to add that to this, again, on a scale that's been tarred to 0. I just have a bigger bottle of filtered water, which I use. Using a Brita or a... We add 700 grams, and we're at 700 grams. Now we're going to add 20% or 200 grams of our starter. So we're going to take 200 grams of this levan, which is ready to go, and we're going to add it here to get to 900. And we can just put this aside for now. So we now have 900 grams of our leavening agent, and we're going to whisk that just to get it dispersed into the water and all nicely dispersed, so that when it gets into the flour, it activates the flour and it's not clumped. There we go. So we have our levain. Now we're going to get our flour mixture together. So the flour I'm using is a strong wheat flour. I want to achieve 1,000 grams in total of flour. I'm going to add 150 grams of whole wheat to my mix. So I've got a scale, it's at 0. I'm going to add 150 grams. There's 150 grams. I don't care if it's a 1 gram out one side or the other. I don't really get to that point, but you can get really accurate if you like. This is my Italian pizza flour, and I'm just going to start adding that till I get to 970 grams. And we're there, about 970 grams total. Now, if you're using bread flour, this step is not required. You just bring it right up to 1,000 grams, but because I'm using a lower gluten flour, I'm going to add vital wheat gluten. Basically, it is the protein part of the flour, and I'm going to bring my number up to 1 kilo or 1,000 grams. And we should be there. Yep, 1 kilogram. So now all I want to do is I want to just start mixing that wheat together and protein so that they're all incorporated. I don't want one kind of flour to be in one spot. So you can make a little bit of a well in the middle. It doesn't really matter. We just want to get now our leavening agent, the levain, which has been dispersed in the water and now is kind of settled a bit. So I'm going to give it a stir. And now I'm just going to start putting this into my, and that's going to start incorporating. Now I have a tool, not required. You can use your nice clean hands right now, but I have a tool that I bought. It's the Danish dough whisk. It's designed specifically for this purpose. It has a nice action that it lets the flour pass through and the dough work its way in. And all we're trying to do here is incorporate the leavening agent, the levain, to our bread. And it's just a rough dough that we're looking for. Nothing smooth, nothing ready to make a bread. This is just the beginning part of it. You notice that we don't have any salt yet. And salt is an integral part of the bread that we eat, because without salt, bread is very bland and lacks flavor. Once we've got this rough dough and we've gotten rid of all of the flour bits that aren't hydrated, we don't need it to be perfect, and it incorporates pretty quickly. Now what's happening is everything is starting to come to life here. So the gluten is starting to build. The yeast, which is the wild yeast, the levain, is starting to activate. It's got a food source here. It's got water. it's just in happy space. So we need to do something called autolyse. So all we want to do here is allow this to marry together and kind of distribute and equalize all that liquid and all that wild yeast into the dough that's sitting here, and it needs about a 45-minute rest, an hour even. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to cover it, shower cap, and I'm going to leave that for 45 minutes, and it's just going to sit here nice and comfortable. All right, so now we've gone about 45 minutes. Our dough has been sitting, autolysing. It's a rough mixture. It's nicely hydrated, but it's by no means ready to make bread. Now we started out with 700 grams of water, and oftentimes I'll just put another 50 grams of water in. However, as my bread recipe has evolved, so I like to add extra virgin olive oil. So this is olive oil coming from the region in Italy that we historically come from. Now I was born in Canada, but my grandparents came from an area in Abruzzi, and funnily enough, and a curious coincidence, my wife and her parents historically come from the same hometown. So it was a happy coincidence that we have the same heritage. And this oil in this bottle comes from a family olive orchard in a small town called Rocca San Giovanni in a region called Abruzzi in Italy. So we have some family extra virgin olive oil. We're going to get 50 grams of this into a container. And again, we're going to start the scale at 0, and we're going to put 50 grams of extra virgin olive oil. Again, you could use water here. It does not need to be extra virgin olive oil. And we want to be pretty accurate here. And then what we're going to do is add 2.5% of salt. So I'm going to take this now, again, tar the scale. I got 0 on the numbers. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to add 25 grams of salt. Salt is really to your particular taste. You can use table salt, you can use sea salt. In this case, I have been using Himalayan pink salt. Like the flavor, it seems to be very nice. So now I'm just going to take that salt and I'm going to try to get that salt to dissolve. It will not dissolve in olive oil. If this was water, I could dissolve this salt very easily in water. It's not going to be the case here. And once I get it to a point where it's kind of dissolved, I'm going to start pouring it in over my dough. And I'm going to want to get as much of it as I can into my dough. And I'm going to use my hands now, which are clean, and I'm going to add it to my dough. So now I have this dough and salt, and I need to incorporate it. Again, the dough is very young. It hasn't started to really ferment. It hasn't gassed up, so it doesn't have as much of a concern that I've got to incorporate that salt and that olive oil. So all I'm doing is reaching underneath and turning and really bringing in the dough to itself. You can see that it already has some structure. It's a dough. It's pretty rough. It's dry in spots still. It's wet in other spots. And we just want to bring it together so that all of that dry flour, which has been in here, and we want to kind of incorporate the olive oil and the flour. We don't want to tear it too much, so we want to fold it in, get that olive oil and salt into it, and that's all we need to do for now. And now we're going to cover it again, and we're going to do a series of folds. So we're now in a stage called bulk fermentation. So for the next 2 hours, every 30 minutes, so 4 times over that period of time, I'm going to fold this dough. Now fortunately, I have another dough going off to the side, in a different container, which I'm going to show you the folding technique on that dough because it's about at its third. This will be the third fold for that dough. Here it is here. Again, it's the same sort of dough. You can see it's a completely different consistency. It's billowy. It's got some gas in it because it's started to ferment. And all I want to do is I want to take the corner of the dough, which has got some stretch to it. I want to pull it up and I want to fold it into itself. I want to turn it about 45 degrees and again turn it into itself. Again, turn and to itself. Now as I do this, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. Now my hands are pretty covered in olive oil. If I didn't have this olive oil in my hands, it would start to stick. I could use water. That's what this is here for. And I'm going to use that to create a dough ball. I typically like to have these containers sitting in a sink a little bit lower than myself because it makes it easier to handle. Now what I'll do is I'll handle it like this and I'll just work it into itself to make it into a ball. Again, not too rough, not too heavy, and again, tuck it in. This has now been turned. As I said, that was the third turn. It needs at least another turn before it gets to the next stage. And now we need a 30-minute rest. It's been about a couple of hours, 2 hours. There's been 4 successive folds every half an hour on the dough. Now we're getting to the final stages here and we're going to start forming our shaped bread or a brulee and our batard. We need to use a banneton, which is going to support the dough as it's doing its fermentation. So it's going to go to a slow fermentation in order so it doesn't stick to the cloth of the banneton. In this case, it's got a nicely made cloth liner. A tea towel would work just as well. Now, the cloth itself will help not to stick to the dough, but it still has a chance because the dough is very wet, and that wet dough has a chance of grabbing onto the cloth. I use white rice flour, a stone ground white rice flour. Any kind of flour would do. You can just dust it with the same bread flour, all-purpose flour, whatever you like. I prefer the contrast of the white rice flour, and you're going to put a pretty generous coating all in the banneton. And again, all you're doing here is this is a non-stick, and we can always brush off if it's got too much. Usually not the case. And that will sit in the bottom and along the sides. Make sure you get it on the sides as well. The whole purpose of that is so when you put the bread dough into there, it does not stick. So these are ready, and we're going to start forming that dough into the final shapes. And I'm going to lightly dust the surface that I have here, and just to make it easier for me to get the dough out onto the counter. I'm going to use a plastic scraper. It just makes it easier to get the dough to come away, and it's just going to plop onto the counter here out of the container. So now we have a dough that's got about 2.5 hours of development from when I first started adding the levan to the actual flour. And it still lacks the full development of the structure, so the gluten hasn't been completely developed. Now what I want to do here is I want to make this into 2 loaves. So I'm going to roughly cut this into what I'm going to believe to be pretty much half and half. Now some people will, of course, weigh it and make sure it's exact. I really don't care that much, so I don't worry about it being exact. I also use a bench scraper, depends on how I'm feeling. But initially what you want to do is you want to keep the flour on one side. So we've got a wet side and a dry side effectively. So the dry side is on the bottom and the wet side's on the top. Now what we need to do is create some tension in the dough. So that's what gives you the lift and the shape and the height of your bread. So what you want to do is you want to create like an envelope. So you can do this side to side. Some people do it side to side, front to back. You're basically taking a 1/3 fold, and then you're going to do the same thing, stretching it out and 1/3 fold. Then you're going to turn it and you're going to do it again. 1/3 fold and a 1/3 fold. You're going to take that, and it's going to be pretty wet. So you're going to just kind of shape it, keep it in, and that's it. It's just going to sit there now for a half an hour. We're going to do the same thing with this one. At this point, these are ready to just sit here and relax and hang out for half an hour. And they'll do that, and then we'll do the final forming and into the bannetons for the fermentation process. Just before we left you at the last point, what I did do is just dust the tops of the bread and covered them up with a clean tea towel. So now they've sat here for about a half an hour, relaxing. You can see they've relaxed a bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to dust the top of this bread with flour, because now this is going to be the dry side and the bottom is actually effectively become the wet side. So we'll give it a little bit of flour and we'll just coat it, not too much, just enough so it won't stick. And then we're going to form them and flip them. So using a bench scraper just makes it easier to grab. Flip it over and you can see it's quite wet on the other side. And again, what we're going to do is the same sort of forming. We're going to stretch them out, and then we're going to 1/3 fold in and 1/3 fold over. And then we're going to take the sides, 1/3 fold in, 1/3 fold over. So what we're doing is we're creating some tension. You can see it's standing up there now. And I'm going to just put a little bit of flour on the bench just so it doesn't stick. And we're going to start forming as much tension. So what we want to do is we want to kind of take my hands and cup them. And what I'm doing is dragging it toward myself and trying to roll the dough in. So it's kind of rolling on the tension of the bench. And you can see it's starting to create tension in the actual dough. So here I'm just turning, rotating it, turning, and you can see it's coming up nicely. And I can feel it rise up into my hands and create that tension. So I have a dough that has now got some tension. I'm going to take it. Now this is the top side, and I'm going to flip it down. So this is what we call the seam side, and I'm just going to pinch it together, and that dough is now ready to go for the fermentation process. You can do a quick fermentation, a warm fermentation, 3 or 4 hours, ambient room temperature, say 75 to 78 degrees, and that'll be ready to bake. But to really develop the flavor in a sourdough bread, you want cold fermentation. So you're going to take this, we're going to cover it now again and put it into the refrigerator overnight, and we'll cook that tomorrow. So now I've formed a traditional brulee, and now I'm going to create basically a batard, which is just another shape of virtually the same sort of bread. So again, 1/3 fold, 1/3 fold. We're trying not to degas it, so we don't want to take out too much of the actual gassing or the lifting of the dough. So we've got it now in a shape, and we're going to just basically work it to tighten up the shape. So we want tight folds. So creating these tight folds. Now we're going to, again, a little bit of flour, not too much. We're going to just do this a little bit differently in that we're dragging it out. So we're getting it to come out a little bit further and then just tucking in the edges. So we're getting more of a log shape or a longer shape rather than a round shape. And as we do that, we keep tucking in the edges, and we're again creating that tension. And if you feel it's getting wet on one side, you can roll it around and drag it the other way. And again, once it's formed, it's a little bit wet. Once it's formed, you're going to grab this, roll it over, and we're going to drop it into the banneton with the seam side up. And what's effectively going to happen is, so the nice side of the bread is down. So when I go to bake this, I'm going to roll this or tip this out of this banneton after it's fermented and has come up nicely. And I'm going to tip this into the Dutch oven, which I'm going to cook it in, and it will be flipped over the other side. So the presentation side is on the bottom here. This is going to sit overnight, and it's going to create the flavor and the rise that you're used to. And it's basically just the natural yeast consuming the proteins, and it's off-gassing CO2, which creates the bubbles in the bread, which is the lift. And that's basically it for today, and that'll be waiting for a nice bake for tomorrow. It's been about 21 hours since we last saw each other and put the sourdough loaves into the refrigerator to ferment overnight. Now we're going to do what's called a poke test, just to make sure that they're ready to be cooked. And that simply is taking a finger, sticking it into the dough, seeing that it comes back, but not completely. It leaves a little bit of indent. If it collapses completely, you've overproofed it. If it comes back really quick, it's not ready. So it's showing a nice little finger indent, so I know that it's pretty much ready to go. It's proofed enough, it's fermented enough to get ready and cook. So I've preheated my oven with my Dutch ovens, my pots. So these pots are preheated at 500 degrees. They're cast iron. They take the heat very easily. So once we get them into the oven, we're going to lower the temperature to 450 degrees. Now, in order for these not to stick to the bottom of the pot, a lot of bakers uses cornmeal. Just simple cornmeal, polenta for the Italians out there. Just a little bit of cornmeal on the bottom of the loaf. And what that will do is provide a non-stick, not too much because you don't want it to burn, but just enough to give it a coating. So we're going to go ahead and put the first loaf into the oven. Take out one of the pans. This is a combo cooker. It's very popular in the sourdough community because it's flat on the bottom, domed on the top. So we're just going to tilt this out from here and let it drop into the pan, approximately in the center. Now we're going to do a scoring of the loaf, which is typically the baker's signature. And what we're trying to do here is quickly cut across the loaf at about 45-degree angle, and we're just going to deeply score the loaf. And that's going to allow it to expand in a controlled manner so that it doesn't split, because the dough is going to want to rise and expand, and we don't want it to split in the wrong spot. So we're going to now do the second one, and again we're going to dust it with cornmeal. And this being a round pot, and it's a round relay or a ball, we'll drop that in. Different kind of signature. We're going to do a straight cut, kind of 4 straight cuts, and it should come up straight up, and we'll see how that works out. So now I'm going to put that in. It's covered for a reason. The reason we do it covered, at least initially, I'm going to drop that temperature down to 450. So what we're doing is we've got a contained environment inside the pan. So there's a lot of moisture in the dough, and that moisture wants to get out. What we want to do is we want to control that so it allow it to rise in a moist environment. Now in a commercial bakery, they have what's called a steam oven that injects water into the oven. That steam allows the dough not to dry out on the crust and then lock itself in. So it's going to allow it to nicely bloom and rise in a moist environment. But we don't want that the whole time because we want a nice crust. So we're going to go 25 minutes. I'm going to set my timer on my watch. And we're going to go 25 minutes in this environment. Then we're going to take the lid off. And hopefully we'll also be able to take a quick peek at what's going on. And we should see the rise in the bread from the hot environment. So it's been about 25 minutes now, and counting. and we're going to check on our bread. We're going to remove the lids and see how they've risen in this warm or hot, steamy environment, and we're going to release that steam so they can start to do its final cook and cure without all the steam in there. So there's the bread. It's come up. You can see it's got a nice crown to it, and it's starting to rise and blister through the top. And the round loaf, same sort of thing. It's come up and it's starting to show. Now we're going to go for another 25 minutes with the lid off, and we'll take another look. And now the last part of it is purely preference. Some people like light colored bread, some people like darker toasted bread. I like my bread really rich and dark and brown, so we're going to probably take a look at it. It might come out at 50 minutes, it might be a couple minutes more. It's been about 45, 46 minutes now, and I kind of peeked in it, and I think that the color is getting to just about where I like it to be, a darker caramel color. So let's take them out and see how we did. There we go. Got one, second, and looking pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to take them away from the hot surface and put them on a cooling rack so that they can cool off nicely. And both of them look pretty good. You can see the contrast with the white rice flour to the actual whole wheat and white flour. These are going to have to cool off. I know people want to get right in there and they want to eat them right away, but it needs a curing process. So approximately 2 hours is probably good if you can stand it before you dig in and check out the crumb on it. But let it cool off before we slice it open and take a look at the crumb on the inside.